Welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into a really significant historical journey today, the French Revolution. But, for you, our listener, given your deep connection to the Catholic faith, we're approaching this not just as some kind of political upheaval, but as a moment where, the destiny of a Catholic king, Louis XVI, and indeed, the spiritual heart of a historically Catholic nation, hung precariously in the balance. Yeah. Picture this, Louis and Marie Antoinette. Catholic royalty, right, but facing a kingdom that's increasingly turning against their faith. It's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I think
Yeah.
what's so striking about 18th century France is just how interwoven the political and the spiritual realms really were. This wasn't just a simple matter of like governance or taxation or, things like that. The monarchy actually possessed a sacred dimension, deeply rooted in France's Catholic identity.
Yeah, for centuries.
For centuries, exactly.
And that's really what we're going to explore today. Like, what role did Louis VI's faith ultimately play in his downfall? And, considering these deep religious currents that were at play, was there ever even a possibility of a peaceful resolution? So the main thing we're looking at today is we're calling it Louis.txt for the sake of this deep dive. It's going to kind of be our guide as we try to understand this pivotal and tragic period through the lens of faith.
Okay.
So let's dive in.
Yeah, let's jump right in.
Okay.
To really kind of grasp, Louis VI's predicament, we have to start with the very bedrock of his authority. He wasn't simply a ruler. He was, in a very real sense, the anointed of the Lord.
Wow.
His coronation back in 1775 at Versailles Cathedral, that wasn't just some symbolic affair. For almost 1,000 years, this ceremony had served as a sacramental bond between the French monarchy and the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really long time. And it wasn't just symbolic, like you were saying. It meant that challenging the king was essentially like challenging God's will.
Yeah.
So that must have created a huge psychological and religious barrier to dissent for many Catholics.
It did, yeah. It really helps us understand why the revolutionaries felt the need to so thoroughly discredit both the monarchy and the church. And they had to break that bond.
Right. It's almost a lost concept in our modern world, this whole idea of a king holding such a divinely ordained position.
I know. It's hard for us to really wrap our minds around it.
It is. But our source really highlights this, that Louis was viewed as the lieutenant of Christ in France, leading Le Royaume très chrétien, the most Christian kingdom.
Yeah.
This wasn't just some title. It reflected a deeply ingrained belief about the divine mandate of the French monarchs.
Absolutely. And central to this understanding was the anointing with the holy ampulla.
Yes.
This was the oil. The tradition held that this is the very same oil that had been used at the baptism of Clovis,
Wow.
the first Frankish king to embrace Christianity.
Okay, so you've got this unbroken lineage stretching back centuries.
Yeah.
And it's linked to this, seemingly miraculous origin, this bestowed upon the monarchy, an almost untouchable status. It was like they were divinely sanctioned, in the eyes of devout Catholics.
Exactly. So any challenge to Louis's rule wasn't just, some political disagreement. It could be perceived as a direct assault on God's established order and on Catholicism itself.
Right, so any attack on him was an attack on the faith.
Exactly.
And then you have Marie Antoinette, who also brought a deeply rooted Catholic upbringing to the French court.
Yes, she did. Her upbringing in Austria under Empress Maria Theresa, a staunchly Catholic ruler, deeply shaped her faith. However, upon her arrival in France, she encountered suspicion, partly due to the influence of Jansenism within the French court.
Oh, interesting. Can you tell us a bit more about Jansenism?
Sure, yeah. Jansenism was this theological movement within Catholicism emphasizing predestination and a more austere form of piety. It had a somewhat strained relationship with Rome and kind of created factions within the French church. So Marie Antoinette, coming from a more traditional Catholic background, walked into this kind of pre-existing religious tension.
Wow, so these internal dynamics within the church could have ripples on the broader political landscape.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating. But despite this underlying suspicion, our source really highlights Marie Antoinette's personal and unwavering devotion.
Precisely. Even as the revolution gained momentum and the royal family faced escalating threats, her faith remained a constant. We see evidence of her persistent prayer life, her engagement in charitable acts, and perhaps most touchingly, her commitment to the religious education of her children, spiritually preparing them for whatever trials lay ahead. Even in their captivity, She consistently encouraged them to remain steadfast in their Catholic beliefs.
It's really incredible. You have this deeply Catholic monarchy.
Yeah.
And then they find themselves facing this growing wave of anti-Catholic sentiment within the revolution.
Yeah, and it's really striking how rapidly that shift occurred. While the storming of the Bastille in July 1789 is often considered the initial spark of the revolution, by the October days later that year, when the royal family was compelled to relocate from Versailles to Paris, the anti-Catholic fervor within the revolutionary crowds was already unmistakable. They weren't shy about it.
And that fervor only intensified as the revolution progressed, didn't it? We see the revolutionary government beginning to directly target the church.
Absolutely. The confiscation of church lands was a significant early blow, presented ostensibly as a measure to alleviate the state's financial crisis. However, it also represented a direct assault on the church's material power and its widespread influence in French society. The revolutionaries increasingly viewed the clergy not as spiritual leaders, but as a corrupt arm of the old regime, obstacles to progress who needed to be dismantled. And this financial attack on the church was followed by an even more direct challenge to its authority with the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790.
Right, which seems like a real turning point, especially for a deeply religious king like Louis XVI.
Indeed. This legislation was a radical and unprecedented attempt to bring the Catholic Church in France entirely under the control of the state. It mandated that priests and bishops be elected by the people and, crucially, swear an oath of loyalty not to the Pope, but to the revolutionary government. This was a direct and fundamental challenge to papal authority and the very structure of the Catholic Church as it had existed for centuries.
So Louis is suddenly in this impossible situation.
Yeah.
He's caught between, his responsibilities as a king, maybe seeing some kind of political need to appease the revolutionaries, but also his profound commitment to his faith and to the authority of the Pope.
Precisely. Our source underscores the profound internal conflict this created for Louis. For him, taking that oath would have constituted a fundamental betrayal of his core religious convictions. Ultimately, he made the momentous decision to refuse, demonstrating that for him, his faith held a higher priority than political expediency. While this act solidified his image as a staunch defender of the church in the eyes of devout Catholics, it simultaneously cemented his status as a clear enemy of the revolution in the eyes of the revolutionaries. It created a seemingly insurmountable divide.
Yeah, he had to make a choice, and he chose his faith.
He did.
Even while under virtual house arrest in the Tuileries Palace, their faith remained a central part of their life.
It really did. And what's truly remarkable, and again highlighted by our source, is the picture of their secret religious practices. Despite the very real danger they faced, they managed to receive the sacraments through the courageous efforts of loyal underground priests who risked their own lives to minister to them. Their daily prayers continued, and Marie Antoinette took on the deeply important role of providing religious instruction to her children, preparing them spiritually for a world that had become increasingly hostile to their faith.
They kept their faith alive even when surrounded by so much opposition.
Yes, they did. And it's also crucial to consider that outside the palace walls, the revolution's animosity towards Catholicism was becoming increasingly blatant and aggressive. The anti-Catholic propaganda became increasingly vitriolic, even resorting to deeply sacrilegious uses of religious imagery to mock and denigrate the royals. This was a deliberate and calculated strategy aimed at undermining not only their political authority, but also their moral and spiritual standing in the eyes of the wider population.
So it was against this backdrop of growing danger and hostility that they made the decision to escape in June 1791, the flight to Varennes.
Right.
Was there a religious motivation behind this too?
Absolutely. That was a central element of their reasoning. Their objective wasn't solely about securing their personal safety. It was fundamentally about reaching loyalist forces, many of whom were deeply Catholic, and potentially securing support from other Catholic powers in Europe to restore order. The underlying hope was to establish a stronghold where the traditional Catholic order could be preserved and potentially, in time, reassert itself across France.
They wanted to save Catholic France.
Yes, that was a core part of their motivation.
And Louis himself seemed to view the situation in religious terms too, right? Our source mentions that he was carrying a letter condemning the revolution.
Yes, that letter is profoundly significant. It clearly indicates that Louis had not simply resigned himself to the new revolutionary order. He fundamentally rejected it. And that rejection was deeply intertwined with his profound concern for the fate of the Catholic Church within France. However, as history tells us, the escape attempt ended in disastrous failure, largely due to the fateful decision to travel in such a conspicuous and easily recognizable manner. That grand coach, a potent symbol of the very monarchy they sought to escape, ultimately led to their recognition in Varennes.
It's almost like a tragic irony. That grand coach, a symbol of the very monarchy they were trying to escape, ultimately led to their recognition in Varennes.
It truly is. And the consequences of that failed escape were far-reaching and devastating. It utterly shattered any remaining vestiges of trust between the king and the revolutionaries. He was no longer perceived merely as a monarch with differing political viewpoints. He was now branded a traitor who had attempted to abandon his people and align himself with foreign powers against the revolution. This catastrophic failure effectively extinguished any realistic possibility of a negotiated settlement.
After the failed escape, it seems like the revolution's posture towards Catholicism became even more aggressive.
Indeed, the situation took a sharp turn. There was a noticeable escalation in hostility directed towards refractory priests who had steadfastly refused to swear the oath to the revolutionary government. Churches became more frequent targets of attacks, and religious symbols were increasingly defaced. Within the leadership of the revolution, discussions about establishing a completely secular state, entirely free from any religious influence, gained significant momentum.
And this eventually leads to the September massacres of 1792. It's hard to grasp the sheer brutality of that event.
It was a truly dark and brutal chapter in French history. Revolutionary mobs, operating with at least the tacit approval of the governing authorities, carried out mass executions of prisoners, and a significant proportion of these victims were priests and other individuals associated with the Catholic Church. The massacre at the Carmelite prison, where over 200 priests were brutally murdered for their refusal to take the oath, stands as a chilling testament to the intense anti-Catholic hatred that had taken root. These acts were rationalized by the revolutionaries as a necessary purging of counter-revolutionary elements, further underscoring the perceived connection between Catholicism and opposition to the revolutionary ideals.
So then we come to the trial and execution of Louis XVI. Given everything we've discussed about his deep faith and the revolution's anti-Catholic trajectory, can we really separate his Catholic identity from the charges brought against him?
That's a profoundly important question. While the formal charge against him was treason against the nation, it is impossible to ignore the pervasive backdrop of his deeply held Catholic faith and his consistent opposition to the revolution's increasingly radical anti-Catholic policies.
It's all connected.
It is. And his imprisonment in the temple became a period of intense personal devotion. He engaged in daily prayer, read scripture extensively, and in a final, deeply symbolic act of piety, he attempted to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Which is especially significant when we consider the history of the Sacred Heart devotion within France.
Absolutely. The visions of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque in the 17th century, the direct requests from Christ himself for France to be consecrated to his Sacred Heart, specifically asking Louis XIV to incorporate the Sacred Heart onto the French flag as a symbol of divine kingship. These requests had gone unheeded by Louis XIV and his subsequent successors. By the time Louis XVI finally recognized the profound significance of this divine request, it was tragically far too late.
And even facing the guillotine, his faith remained a source of strength.
Indeed. His dignified bearing on the scaffold, his solemn declaration of his innocence regarding the charges against him, his heartfelt forgiveness extended to his executioners, and his final prayer offered for the well-being of France all speak volumes about a man deeply anchored in his Catholic faith, even in the face of martyrdom.
He died a martyr for his faith.
In many ways, yes.
And then months later, Marie Antoinette also met her end.
Yes. Her final months were marked by unimaginable suffering and hardship in prison, yet our source emphasizes the enduring strength of her faith. Even in the moments immediately preceding her execution, she received absolution from a loyal priest, highlighting the profound and lasting importance of her Catholic beliefs. Her quiet dignity and her final, almost apologetic words on the scaffold are a powerful testament to her character in the face of unimaginable adversity.
So after their deaths, the revolution entered its most radical phase, the Reign of Terror.
Yes.
This seems like a very deliberate attempt to completely erase Catholicism from France.
That's an accurate and chilling assessment. Under the Reign of Terror, the revolution launched a full-scale assault on the Catholic Church. Christianity was officially abolished. Churches were forcibly closed or repurposed as secular temples of reason. Priests and nuns who refused to renounce their faith faced relentless persecution and often execution, as exemplified by the courageous martyrs of Compiègne. Even Notre Dame Cathedral, the very heart of French Catholicism, was desecrated. They even went so far as to implement a revolutionary calendar, deliberately replacing the traditional Christian one.
It's really just a systematic destruction of the church.
It was.
So looking back on everything, especially through the lens of faith, the big question is, could there have been a peaceful resolution? Was there any way to avoid all this violence and the rejection of France's spiritual heritage?
This is a deeply complex question, and with the benefit of hindsight, achieving a peaceful resolution appears incredibly challenging, given the fundamental and seemingly irreconcilable clash between the concept of a divinely ordained Catholic monarchy and the increasingly secular, indeed anti-religious, aims of the Revolution. Louis XVI's own profound internal struggle, with his unwavering commitment to his faith often dictating his actions, such as his resolute refusal to sanction the civil constitution, undoubtedly played a significant role in escalating the tensions.
And there's the unfulfilled consecration to the Sacred Heart.
Yes.
That seems really significant, especially with the later revelations to Sister Lucia and their connection to the French king's failure to heed Christ's request.
What's particularly thought-provoking here is the perspective offered by these later prophecies, suggesting that a different course of action, one grounded in heeding divine requests and embracing shared Christian values, might have averted the subsequent disaster.
Or like there could have been a different outcome.
Potentially, yes. And the historical comparison with Britain's gradual transition to a constitutional monarchy offers a tantalizing glimpse of a what-if scenario. Could Louis XVI have successfully reformed the monarchy had the intense anti-Catholic sentiment not been so pervasive and the ill-fated escape attempt never occurred? It's a question that invites profound reflection.
It makes you wonder.
It does.
Ultimately, though, it seems like the radicalization of the revolution, fueled in no small part by its deep-seated anti-Catholicism and the perception of the monarchy as inextricably linked to the church, made any meaningful compromise increasingly improbable.
That's right.
And, events like the flight to Varennes and the September massacres only made things worse.
Right.
Once the king was executed, any chance of negotiating with the old order was gone.
Precisely. The trajectory of the revolution, with its escalating and relentless war on the church, created a situation where reconciliation became virtually impossible.
So, the main thing we see here is this strong connection between the downfall of Louis XVI and the attack on Catholicism in France. For the revolutionaries, dismantling the monarchy and eradicating the influence of the church were deeply intertwined and mutually reinforcing goals. They couldn't have one without the other.
It is truly striking to consider how the rejection of that deeply rooted spiritual heritage had such far-reaching and devastating consequences for France, ushering in a period of intense violence, instability, and a fundamental reshaping of the nation's identity.
And that leads us to our final thought for you to consider. Given the deep personal faith of Louis XVI and the enduring historical significance of Catholicism in France, could a genuine and concerted commitment to reconciliation rooted in shared Christian values on both sides of the burgeoning divide have fundamentally altered the course of the revolution? Could it have averted the subsequent widespread bloodshed and the ultimate rejection of the nation's long-held spiritual heritage? It's a question that makes you think about the consequences of embracing or rejecting faith within the political sphere.
This raises a fundamental and enduring question about the role of faith in shaping the course of historical events and the potential for different outcomes when spiritual values are either embraced or actively rejected during times of profound crisis.
If you'd like to delve deeper into this fascinating and tragic period, you might find it particularly valuable to explore the rich history of the Sacred Heart devotion in France, the inspiring stories of the refractory priests who stood firm in their faith against immense pressure, or even to consider drawing parallels between the French Revolution and other pivotal periods in history where faith and secular power have found themselves in conflict. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.